So, the original Resident Evil shambled onto store shelves in 1996 and pioneered the survival horror genre.
Its most memorable features are its eerie mansion setting, shuffling infected, and endearing B-movie dialogue. Master of Unlocking, Jill Sandwich, anyone?
It also introduces us to series mainstays Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, and Albert Wesker, amongst other side characters, all comprising the elite unit known as STARS. Think SWAT as an apt comparison. Over the course of the game, our heroes uncover the sinister machinations of the hilariously villainous Umbrella Corporation.
Otherwise known as Parasol LLC.
No. They do spectacular battle with T-virus monstrosities, tank controls, and terribly perfect voice acting.
Still, Resident Evil delivered genuine scares and coined the term survival horror, expecting players to manage scarce ammo, herbs, and even saves, while solving puzzles all under the constant threat of zombie attacks. Truly an essential influential classic, despite its rough edges.
Now, 2 years later, Resident Evil 2 took the foundation of the first game and mutated it to an apex predator of an experience. Instead of the horror being confined to a mere mansion, all of Raccoon City is overrun and the spectacle is immense.
Players fill the boots of two characters this time around. Rookie cop Leon S. Kennedy, on his first day no less, talk about a rough start, and Claire Redfield, a college student searching for her missing brother Chris. The game doubled down on content with two intertwined campaigns, represented by the A-B scenario system, and introduced even more mutated abominations like the Licker and the iconic antagonist Mr. X without his fedora. Everything was dialed up, more action, so many more settings, and elaborate gore galore, oh my. If Resident Evil 1 was a cult horror flick, Resident Evil 2 was a blockbuster sequel and maintained and expanded on what made the original stand out. It's comparable to James Cameron's Aliens when discussing the best sequels of all time. It's a fan favorite and objectively one of the best entries in the series.
Fun fact, Edgar Wright cited Resident Evil 2 as a primary inspiration for Shaun of the Dead, so make of that what you will inspiration-wise. Commercially, Resident Evil 2 was a juggernaut. It became the fastest-selling video game in North America up until that point. It grossed over $19 million in its first weekend and helped propel video games as a whole into the mainstream. Its impact cannot be understated, and I appreciate it solely from that perspective.
Now, that's going to be a tough act to follow. But Umbrella and Raccoon City are not done with our heroes yet. Enter Resident Evil 3, Nemesis. This time, the Master of Unlocking is in the driver's seat, trying to escape an apocalyptic Raccoon City while being chased by one of the most notorious trenchcoat-wearing assholes in all of gaming, Nemesis. This giant-ass rocket launcher-wielding safe room-busting bioweapon asshat stalks Jill through the entire game, randomly smashing through walls while growling "Stars," his version of
But Jill can look out for herself and is able to execute dodges and quick 180-degree turns to aid in evading the creep. She must have learned these moves in a hip-hop self-defense class between the mansion incident and now. The game is somewhat shorter and more linear than Resident Evil 2, with less diverging paths. The addition of Nemesis and faster-paced action kept me on edge, like Resident Evil meets Terminator. Despite feeling like a bit of a side story, Nemesis provided a satisfying and explosive conclusion to the Raccoon City saga.
Fast forward 6 years later to 2005. Capcom decided to radically shake up the formula, and boy did they ever. Resident Evil 4 didn't just shake up a franchise in danger of resting on its laurels. It influenced the entire gaming industry, much like the first title in the series.
In this landmark entry, we follow Giga Chad, now Secret Agent Leon S. Kennedy, and his magnificent hair to rural Spain in order to rescue the president's daughter from a cult. Yes, the scale of the threat has grown from residence to city to entire geographic region. Here, Leon contends with not zombies, but Los Ganados, a hive mind controlled by a telepathic parasite. They are smarter, more strategic, and faster than the old T-virus shamblers. To combat this, players are armed with a new over-the-shoulder camera perspective and control scheme. that not only immersed us in the action and horror like never before, but literally changed the way games are played to this day.
Ditching the fixed camera angles of old, Resident Evil became much more action-heavy and dynamic, with pinpoint aiming and damage, contextual melee finishers, suplexing a cult victim anyone, and frantic large-scale defense scenarios, all of which would become series staples. Leon's snarky one-liners and absurd reactions gave the game an endearing, self-aware B-movie vibe that perfectly complemented its fine-tuned, white-knuckled action. No, not you. In short, Resident Evil 4 blew everyone away and dragged survival horror kicking and screaming into a new, bold era for better or worse.
So, how do you follow up a genre and medium-defining masterpiece like Resident Evil 4? Capcom's answer was to double down on action and explosions, with an emphasis on co-op gameplay. Scary, right? Not so much, but it was safe and successful. Released in 2009, Resident Evil 5 sent series veteran and serious beefcake Chris Redfield deep into the Kijuju region of Africa to investigate an emerging bioterror threat. He is joined by series newcomer Shiva Alomar, who shines as a character, but has been frustratingly underutilized in the franchise since. The game retains Resident Evil 4's style, with the addition of the game being fully playable in co-op. There's even a face button dedicated to begging your partner for healing.
The game gave us the most over-the-top action this series has ever seen up until this point, including Temu brand Arnold Schwarzenegger literally punching a f***ing boulder in a drawn-out QTE sequence of a final battle, officially achieving meme immortality. Resident Evil 5 also wrapped up the storyline of Big Bad Albert Wesker, who mutated from a glasses-wearing chess master to leather daddy Dolph Lundgren, cosplaying as Agent Smith over the course of the series. At the end of the day, Resident Evil 5 is polished, fun, and packed with content, but since the horror atmosphere took a back seat, longtime fans of the series may have been left wanting more. On the commercial front, however, Resident Evil 5 was a smashing success. To date, it is the most best-selling Resident Evil game of all time, moving about 13.5 million copies. One could say it has achieved
complete global saturation.
One can only imagine what sort of a crossroad this left Capcom at. Their most popular entry in their crown jewel franchise was also the most decisive. How do you follow up a legitimate hit, which may have also alienated a fair bit of the core fan base? Albert Wesker's never-before-mentioned son looking like a malnourished Gears of War character riding a motorcycle and punching zombies is not the way to do it. It's not a hot take to say Resident Evil 6 was not the right direction for the series. It seems like Capcom learned all the wrong lessons from Resident Evil 5's runaway success. More dumbass story, more campaigns, more vehicles and paramilitary groups f***ing about, less tension, less player agency, less charm, and less of a sense of place. Before this, the mansion, Raccoon City, the Spanish village, and the castle felt like living, breathing characters, built to bolster the isolation and horror that defined the series. None of Resident Evil 6's generic urban settings can be described in this way.
Yeah, it's a rough place for such an iconic series to find itself nearing the end of the PS3, Xbox 360 console generation. To be fair, the game featured popular characters, had tons of content for campaigns, and moment-to-moment gameplay. It does feel refined and solid at the very least. You can tell they tried, and a lot of effort was put into this entry despite its lukewarm reception from fans and critics alike. It's safe to say this reception directly inspired the series to course-correct in a big way for the next installment.
After the roller coaster / downward spiral of Resident Evil 6, Capcom saw the light and brought the series back to its grimy, uncomfortable roots with Resident Evil 7, Biohazard, in 2017. This entry was a bold new shift. It introduced a new protagonist, everyman Ethan Winters, a gritty first-person perspective, a first in a mainline Resident Evil, and a much more intimate horror experience. Set in the dilapidated Baker family estate, deep in the Louisiana bayou. Gone were the gun-wielding commandos, global conspiracies, and boulder-punching boss fights of previous generations. Resident Evil 7 was all about the atmospheric, slow-burn horror. The game draws a healthy amount of inspiration from modern horror films and games. You'd be blind not to see shades of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Evil Dead, PT, and Amnesia. While clearly taking notes from these properties, Biohazard is a true Resident Evil. Gameplay, level design, and story-wise, this game is incredibly true to the DNA of Resident Evils 1 through 3.
The story starts with blank slate Ethan searching for his missing wife Mia, which leads him to the Bakers, a family that defines the term toxic in the most dysfunctional way possible. Opening hours treat us to a tense, claustrophobic escape from the Baker Manor, while the irreverent, immortal family patriarch Jack Baker stalks us. These early hours pay off as a love letter to the mansion setting of the first Resident Evil and the stalking terror of the Resident Evil 3 respectively. Later hours lose some focus as we brave mold-infested swamps and derelict watercraft. But the first-person perspectives kept the high tension and the environments all the more immersive. At the end of the day, the game is credited with reanimating the Resident Evil franchise, proving that Capcom can scare the pants off of us when they want to. It smartly balances new elements with classic Resident Evil staples and is an essential horror experience. After a journey around the world, the series brought it back home.
That brings us to the most recent mainline release as of writing, Resident Evil Village, also known as Resident Evil 8. It was unleashed in 2021 and continues Ethan Winter's saga, but flips the everyman's script of Resident Evil 7 with generous helpings of gothic horror, elaborate set pieces, and callbacks to past highs of the series, particularly Resident Evil 4. Ethan finds himself in a remote European village filled with a comical variety of unspeakable horrors, including but not limited to werewolves, vampires, possessed dolls, and even reoccurring characters with shady intentions. The game's pacing and tone are truly a roller coaster, effectively keeping players guessing what the next outlandish scenario will bring. It's worth mentioning that while the game has some of the most goofy, self-aware, over-the-top moments, I would consider it to genuinely have the most scary encounter of any Resident Evil game easily. Maybe any game ever, but that's up for debate.
It's for these reasons and more that Capcom has proven that it really is possible to make a horror game bigger and better. The two don't have to be mutually exclusive. Instead of 4 sloppy, disconnected stories, we are treated to 4 gorgeous, distinct domains, each offering different horror flavors and aesthetics. From Castle Dimitrescu's classic gothic horror vibes to whatever the hell House Beneviento is, in spite of the mountains of content, concepts, and ideas, Village rarely feels bloated or homogenized. It feels finely tuned regardless of its massive scope, which is no easy feat. All that said, Resident Evil Village is a love letter to Resident Evil fans and horror fans in general. It gave us mommy vampires, rabid werewolves, and disgusting mutants. It tightened the screws on the gameplay and wrapped it all up in a nice fairy tale gone awry aesthetic. It's as if Capcom said, let's throw Ethan into the witch's cauldron and see what happens. The final result, a witch's brew that is finally attuned and keeps us coming back for more.
As modern gamers, we owe a great debt of gratitude to Resident Evil for all the innovation it has bestowed upon us over the past 30 years. In spite of its campy, corny veneer, there's genuine heart that goes into each installment of the franchise that will be talked about for years to come. So, Paint, what's your favorite Resident Evil game, mainline?
My favorite mainline game would definitely have to be, and I'm padding for time here while I think of all of the mainline games that we just discussed, I would have to say 8. Resident Evil 8 is probably my favorite.
Love it. Why would you say that is?
I don't want to say just because of the big vampire lady in there, but it's kind of also because of the big vampire lady. But I think for me personally, I like the Universal horror movies. I have all of the original black and white horror films, and you know, one way to get me in your corner is just have some big old monsters in there and freaky ladies, and I'm all in. What about you, Ryan? What's your...
Heard and agreed on the Resident Evil Village. Not that it's my favorite, but I love the inclusion of the diverse array of monsters, not just... I mean, they're all mutants at the end of the day, but not just like outright zombies or mutants. They get a lot more creative with it, a lot more fairy tale-esque, as we touched on, and I just feel like it's by far the most creative and eccentric entry in the series.
It's definitely out there, I think, in terms of just like what Resident Evil is usually construed as a zombie, where Resident Evil 8 just kind of flipped that on its head. And yeah, that's definitely a favorite.
Put werewolves in the limelight and, and vampires. And it was a awesome time. For me, a little bit busy thematically, maybe. It comes with the territory, but I loved all the homages to Resident Evil 4, and I loved the expanded controls and the expanded progression and the merchant and everything he had to offer.
Yeah.
And the variety of the settings, including the castle and just the village itself, were spectacular.
Yeah, it reminded me a lot of Bloodborne too, in the sense of like of the boss kind of battles, you know?
Yeah, and just like the aesthetic and all of that. I agree.
So my favorite game is 8, but yours though.
Mine, and I guess I'm kind of torn, not to be cliche, between 4 and 5. I think I appreciate 4 for just getting me into the series. Resident Evil 4 on the Wii was my first Resident Evil game.
Shake it, Ryan.
And it was a phenomenal experience and made me fall in love with the series. I didn't quite realize how prestigious the series was when I started playing it, but it gave me a good first impression. And Resident Evil 5 was the first game that was like hyped up by the media and Capcom, and that I was there for the initial release of, that I bought day one. And I have so many phenomenal memories in it, both in single player and co-op. I acknowledge where some of the deviations from the horror trappings more to the action trappings were for the worse and not for the better. But damn, it just is gameplay-wise tuned so nicely to be replayed and played with multiple people, and just grinding out all of the treasures, the challenges, and the difficulty levels. I feel like at the end of the day, as a game, makes Resident Evil 5 my favorite to actually play.
You know, that's great too, because my first Resident Evil game was actually Resident Evil 5. And then I was introduced to the world via the mansion, and then of course the in Resident Evil 1 after playing Resident Evil 5 to see where it all began. And then in the, you know, of course the movie theaters, they have those little shooter games that you can play before or after a movie in the arcade, and they had a Resident Evil like with the guns and the cords.
I'm so jealous.
Yeah,
Resident Evil Icon game would have been fun.
Well, yeah, it was. I mean, they were buggy as hell, right? But that was kind of my introduction to Resident Evil, was Resident Evil 5, and then playing or watching a playthrough, I don't exactly remember, of Resident Evil 1, and then just getting into the series from there.
Love it. And I guess my favorite mainline would be 5, but I guess if we're talking non-mainline games or remakes, and I guess I don't know if we're considering the remakes mainline games, they probably are.
Yeah, I would categorize them as mainline.
Yeah, I think Resident Evil Revelations 2 in terms of non-mainline games did a lot right, especially when it did come out. I think it was like it was Resident Evil 6 and then Revelations and Revelations 2, and I feel like Revelations 2 and Revelations just gave us a lot of faith that Capcom could right the ship after Resident Evil 6. And we saw a lot of good faith from Capcom in between Resident Evil 6 and 7 with the Revelations series. So I have a lot of love for Resident Evil Revelations 2. So that would probably be my favorite non-mainline game if we're not counting the remakes.
Yeah.
But if we are counting the remakes, then Resident Evil 4 Remade is my favorite Resident Evil game, period.
You know, same. For remakes, yeah. I think that just has... I feel like the remake for 2 and 3 definitely breathed more life into the Resident Evil franchise, especially with the updated graphics and everything. But I think for the most part, Resident Evil 4 just, you know, they just made a great game better. You know, they really expanded, I think. But yeah, for me personally, I don't have any favorite non-mainline games. I don't think I've played any, to be honest.
Yeah, I'll give credit where credit's due, but I think you're not missing out on much. I think
Yeah, that's what I hear.
I think
Yeah.
generally, like, there's a lot of there's a lot of good stuff to be found, like Code Veronica, the Revelation series, but generally, if you've dabbled with the majority of the remakes and played Resident Evil 5 and are aware of what came before that, I feel like you have a pretty solid understanding of what the series has to offer.
Yeah. And I think, I feel like without the non-mainline games, if you're talking from a narrative standpoint, the story is so wild with just the mainline games that when you incorporate those into the narrative, it just goes crazier. Because I don't remember exactly what goes on, but I know there's twins involved. And then I know there's one that cross-dresses at some point. And then I know that, yeah, definitely something happens to someone somewhere and it inspires something down the line. It just jumps into so many different crazy avenues. Like there's a wild like outlaw named Billy in the middle of Raccoon City. Like, what?
And I feel the same way.
Yeah.
A lot of these spin-off characters that I have no right to be criticizing the relevancy of because I know nothing about them, because I haven't played the spin-offs they're in. But to me, they just come off as less appealing and less interesting and less critical to the lore of the series than your mainline characters, a la Chris Redfield and Leon Kennedy, etc. Claire and Jill.
Ada Wong.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
To a degree, I would even almost feel like Shiva Alamar, it would be the Billy of the recent generation almost.
The Billy?
Yeah, where she's just there.
Yeah.
She's
never talked about again.
And we could talk about what a good character she is, but if you weren't there in the moment, then you're going to have no real motivation to go and look her up and get the details on her, because the series doesn't give her the limelight she deserves. As far as we know, Billy deserves his own mainline entry.
Maybe that's another Resident Evil game that's going to come out. Maybe Billy's going to get a solo game with Shiva, of all people.
I love Shiva and the Adventures of Bayou Billy.
Oh my God, yeah. Crazy. So then I mean, touching on the remakes though, because we made a point to not talk about the remakes specifically and just talk about the original Resident Evil games, where the remake or the remaster added the fedora to Mr. X when he originally didn't have it in the original game. We didn't really want to jump into that in this episode because I feel like we could dedicate a whole episode to talking about remakes and the non-mainline games. But of those, what was your favorite remake?
Resident Evil 4, probably.
Sorry, let me revise my question. Before Resident Evil 4, so 1 or 2, what was your favorite remake of 1 or 2?
And I've never played Resident Evil Remake 1.
Okay.
So I need to get back to it. It's top of my Steam will get to list.
Yeah.
But Resident Evil 2, I have such an appreciation for the remake because original Resident Evil 2, as iconic as it is, I had a really hard time getting into it as a kid just because I was a kid when it came out. I was 7 years old. It was a little bit heavy of an experience and a little bit dense of one as well. And just the impact was lost on me at the moment. And to be able to go back and see that experience as it was seen at the time through fresh eyes and have it be so incredibly true to the source material, but also just such, I'm not going to say technological marvel, but technically competent and could hang technically with what was coming out at the time.
Right.
And just a beautiful game with classic structure, and took this police station and turned it into an incredibly well-designed, intricate, layered puzzle box that I think Capcom's level design prowess, especially in the more modern games, it doesn't get enough praise. I would put it up there with some of From Software's level design, just unlocking your shortcuts and solving your puzzles and navigating this beautiful masterpiece of a labyrinth of Resident Evil 2 made it feel really special to me and made this tiny kind of dense location feel a lot larger than it was. And then the remake of Resident Evil 3, I like a lot more than most people do. Most people consider it just to be a really weak entry and lazy and a lot shorter, and that it should have been DLC for Resident Evil Remake 2. but I kind of feel like that was the vibe of the original Resident Evil 3 to 2 anyway, and that was a more condensed, less linear, more cinematic, action-heavy experience. And that is what we got from Resident Evil 3 Remake, and I feel like for what it was a heck of a lot of fun.
Well said.
Thank you.
Said. Out of my favorites, I think definitely 2 would be my favorite remake. Especially because that's when I started playing Resident Evil again. Like I got into Resident Evil again. And I mean, yeah, graphics wise, just it's keeping up, it's keeping up with everything else that was going on. And that was what God of War, the remake came out, or the remaster.
Right around that time.
Yeah, not remaster, but like
the reimagining
of it. Yeah. So.
And I feel that the Resident Evil and their newer games, they've used what they call the re-engine. I don't think it's named after Resident Evil, but just the new engine that they've brought brings a lot of life and dynamic activity and amazing lighting to the games.
Yeah, and it really sets more of a mood too, because I mean, they had technical limitations with the previous games, but now with today's technology, they're constantly pushing the limits of what can happen in the gaming industry, and I feel like they're able to horror fans, we're living it up because you're more able to set a mood with just atmosphere alone, I think.
And sometimes we refer to like shiny graphics as being like superficial, and so I feel like some like fancy graphics, I sometimes don't give them the praise they deserve because I more have an eye for like game design and structure and gameplay loop, and I value gameplay over some like superficial things. But especially in horror games, like the quality and the fidelity and the depth of graphics and the quality of lighting really can enhance the experience on a deeper level, on a gameplay level.
Yeah, like we last talked about Stardew, right? But I feel like if we were to put the graphics quality of, for example, the Resident Evil 2 remake onto Stardew Valley, it wouldn't necessarily go as appreciated as it is, I don't think. I mean, because it's not needed.
No, it's
right?
not.
For what the gameplay is. But with Resident Evil, being in a horror setting, that's kind of the point I'm hammering in, is like, you need to set a mood, and your environment needs to be its own character. And I think that just leads us back to Resident Evil Village, where every little part of that town was its own character and perfectly matched with their boss.
And felt real, and when you're trying to scare someone, maybe photorealism executed well is the way to go.
Yeah.
Not always, I'm sure, but I feel like in Resident Evil's case, the closer they get to photorealism, the scarier it gets.
Exactly.
Which, just as someone who doesn't consider myself a graphics snob, the graphics and the technology play a huge part in their ability to tell their story and immerse us in their experience. They wouldn't have been able to do a first-person Resident Evil in 1999. And so what Village and what 8 accomplished wouldn't have been possible, and they're scarier than ever.
Yeah, I want to say there was a reading that I did. It was in some video game book. I'll link it. But basically what I had read was they didn't have the technology at the time for the Resident Evil, but I think it was Resident Evil 4 or Resident Evil 3 that did the over-the-shoulder camera, and that just became a staple across a lot of video games, is because they created that, or they learned it and implemented it. So
I mean, and that would have been 4 with that camera angle. I feel like those who know, but I feel like people don't in general give Capcom and Resident Evil enough credit for kind of establishing a template for third-person gameplay that every single game to this day sort of leans on. And for everything it's done for horror, I feel like it's just done as much for gaming in general.
Yeah.
And Capcom has their ups and their downs, but with the Resident Evil remakes, with the Monster Hunter series, there's another pretty darn well executed series of theirs right now, and I feel like they're giving Devil May Cry its due respect with Devil May Cry 5. Like, I feel like it's a good time to be a Capcom fan.
Right. Well, and especially speaking of Devil May Cry, that I think that kind of perfectly segues us into the adaptation, category. Devil May Cry is at the time of recording going to have an anime about the show. It's or about the game. It's either a show or an anime. about the game. And I thought that with with the track record of Resident Evil and even Monster Hunter,
Okay, heard.
having adaptations and them striking out with the video game fans, but not necessarily the movie fans. I mean, we got to talk about it. Like, do you like the Resident Evil movies, or do you not like the Resident Evil movies, or is it a gray area for you?
Yeah, probably safe to say I don't like them.
What?
They're not without their high points, but as someone who was introduced to the world of Resident Evil through Resident Evil 4 and kind of like developed my love with it through 4 and 5, and then I was a sleepover at my friend's house. We were enjoying a co-op session of Resident Evil 5. And he said, "Hey, I got the new Resident Evil movie. We should watch it." And then we plugged that puppy in, and
yeah,
that is not Resident Evil.
I feel like for me, I have questionable taste sometimes because I absolutely love the 96 Mortal Kombat movie. I absolutely love that movie. I also absolutely love the Mario Brothers movie.
That's an issue, like the old one, right?
Yeah, the one with John Leguizamo. Yes,
that's a problem.
So, and I also love the Tomb Raider movies with Angelina Jolie. So you can see, dear gamers, how my opinion might be not skewed towards the gamers that those movies are trying to. Or the games, I guess, that the movies are trying to adapt from, but I'm able to see it through a lens of like, this movie's standing on its own, and I've always like viewed adaptations of that. Like, unfortunately, it's not gonna be a one-to-one remake or build and expand.
How do they choose to represent this experience?
Right. I like the Resident Evil movies because when I was growing up, I really loved the female empowerment movies. Being a little girl myself, right? So I feel like with those movies, they are pretty badass. They have a lady front and center, badass woman. She fights, she kills zombies, and that's all I needed from it. Now, I feel where most people get hung up is that they titled the movie Resident Evil, and they took a lot of the characters and basically Fortnited them. They grabbed the characters and they plopped them in the world, right? And used them for what served the plot. But for me, I'm kind of able to switch my brain off and be like, okay, Resident Evil, the movies, completely different thing. Resident Evil games, that's where I know I'm getting my good lore. And I think most gamers and nowadays it's a little different because we're actually getting faithful adaptations with like Fallout and
Mario and
the,
Sonic.
Mm-hmm. So I think now companies are learning to not piss off gamers as much and actually look at the source material and pay homage to that source material. Where with the Resident Evil movies, they're like my junk food, They're not necessarily a one-to-one adaptation, but they have all of the little bits I love of Resident Evil and they peppered them in.
Is Underworld pretty similar to the Resident Evil movies?
Underworld is not really that similar.
Okay.
In terms of story, they're different, right? You got your vampires and your werewolves fighting each other in a Romeo Juliet type thing, and then you have your Resident Evil, which is literally just trying to survive the apocalypse with these horrible mutations, and then it kind of gets soap opera-ish from there. But that's why I'm like, it's junk food, where Underworld is like really a cemented franchise. Resident Evil kind of just wants to live in a world.
The movies just dip in and out of this continuity a little bit.
They dip in and out of the continuity, and then they also kind of forget the rules of their world, which is fine for me because that's what I know I'm going into. But I can see how it would piss off gamers who have played these games and then they watch this movie titled Resident Evil, and then it's not Resident Evil. Then, though, that does bring us to the new movie, Welcome to Raccoon City. Have you seen that one?
I haven't. You'll have to fill me in a bit.
Okay, so yeah, basically they tried to reboot it, I want to say in 2021, and they got a bunch of young new faces. They got Leon Kennedy. They were trying to do the storyline of Resident Evil 1, No,
2 maybe with
2.
Leon?
It was 2 with Leon, yeah. But then they mixed them up. So yeah, they were trying to reboot the movie franchise with Resident Evil 2 storyline.
That sounds perfect.
But it was so low budget that, yeah, it was very low budget, and you can kind of see that it's low budget. But I had a great time, and I feel like if a lot of Resident Evil fans would have stuck with it, stuck to their guns, and supported the movie, and if it would have gotten more traction, then we would have had a great franchise on our hands.
That's one that I'm going to have to watch and I'll update you on in terms of my opinion on that one.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
I've heard and I've not heard too much buzz on it, but
yeah, I mean, it definitely mixes in some elements. You remember that one monster girl with a sack on her head? I forget what her name is, but she had like a sack on her head.
I want to say her name's like Lisa Trevor. Or
yes,
something.
Lisa Trevor. They had her in that movie.
Okay, nice. Just kind of.
Yeah, just kind of there.
Okay, love it.
So it was interesting. They definitely paid a pretty good homage to the second game. But yeah, I liked it. But I like my junk food a little better.
There's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. I have to check it out soon.
There's also really briefly, there's a TV show that's a Resident Evil. It's a Netflix TV show. It's going to piss you off. It does not follow the games at all. It doesn't follow the games. It has Albert Wesker in there. I think it was Lance Redding.
Lance Reddick.
Lance Reddick. Yeah, one of his last roles. He played Albert Wesker. But Albert Wesker is not kind of who we've come to see him as in the Resident Evil franchise. We see him as this big chess playing, big guy who's always got another plan on another plan on another plan, right? But he's not that guy. He's kind of like a scientist for the Umbrella Corporation in this show. And it's also plays out like a soap opera, but you can't really follow this as well as the movies, where the movies you can kind of tell where it's going. We're all centered on Alice. But with this show, you're kind of like, what are we doing? They
almost go for like the non-linear storylines, sort of like the Witcher Netflix series almost, where you're going...
No, not even. It's, the Resident Evil TV show on Netflix. It'll piss you off, Ryan, but I think you should watch it.
I'll have to check it out, absolutely.
And then there's the animated movies, which I feel like follow almost true to the characters of Resident Evil, but not necessarily like the stories.
But putting these like well represented characters in new stories seems promising.
That's what it is. I like them for the most part, but then again, we know my taste is
we know your taste.
We know my taste is not the majority.
I feel like I've seen maybe some clips from those ones, and they seem to be like a lot more on brand for the series.
They're pretty good,
so, yeah, I'd like to see those ones.
I feel like I felt when I was watching them like they were cutscenes of a game.
And
honestly,
that could be a positive or a negative. It's one of those things.
I think it really depends on the viewer.
It depends on the viewer, absolutely. Like sometimes I know I've described some movies that I don't some scenes in movies that I don't hold in high regard as being like video game cutscenes.
Right.
So it's like,
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that kind of leads us though to what do we want to see for, upcoming installments of the Resident Evil franchise? Because I feel like we like the Resident Evil franchise. I dare say it's one of my favorite franchises, even though I don't play it over and over and over again. I still love the Resident Evil franchise. I'll still support it. For me specifically, I don't really know what I would want to see in a future installment.
Resident Evil, probably, it could be my favorite franchise, just in terms of, I was about to say consistency, but that's not necessarily the right word. And it's the highs and the lows. Just as a gamer for the past 30 years, it has defined the genre and the medium. It is incredibly fun. It is predictable, but meets and exceeds expectations frequently, not always. But it is a phenomenal game. I wouldn't trade it for the world. After Resident Evil Village, I feel like they sort of wrapped up Ethan Winter's storyline, but I feel like they just sort of have maybe his storyline was a bit of a divergence, and in the background they've been rebuilding the storyline for Chris Redfield and company.
Could be, yeah.
And I
With
think
the BSAA.
I think we're going to see the resurgence of Umbrella and the BSAA somehow, and we're going to be playing probably as
Rose, maybe. I mean, that's what the DLC.
Do we think Rose is going to be a protagonist or antagonist in the next game?
Honestly, that's hard to tell because she kind of. She's a wild card.
I think they were kind of setting her up as an antagonist for the universe. And I could be wrong, but I think they were setting up Chris and Rose as like maybe opposing forces.
Okay.
For like the upcoming game.
Yeah.
And whether Chris is a good guy or a bad guy, and ditto for Rose.
Yeah.
I don't know, but I could see it being as like a conflict, like growing between those two.
Okay. Well, we do see Ada Wong. Well, not necessarily see her. We do see her in Resident Evil 4. She's still alive and kicking. And then we do see her concept art for Resident Evil 8. Well, and she was a plague doctor. So
she survives Resident Evil 6.
Yeah.
So we know she's there. Like she's around, and where Leon is, Ada will be there. And maybe, I feel like Village was really a spiritual successor to Resident Evil 4.
Yeah.
And I feel like the series, when they can, they're going to try to incorporate all things Resident Evil 4 and all things Leon into the formula when they can.
Especially Leon being a heavy hitter, in terms of like fan favorites.
I think he's the face of the series. As much as you would think it would be like
Chris,
Jill and Chris.
Yeah.
I think it's Leon. And, maybe they just leave the overly complex, overwrought BSAA and Umbrella stuff on the back burner and focus on
another Leon story.
Focus on a Leon and Ada story.
The will they, won't they?
The will they, won't they?
Yeah.
I would love that.
Yeah.
But in terms of setting and in terms of scope of it, the sky's the limit. I think Capcom keeps us guessing really effectively in that regard.
I would like to make an educated wish. If Capcom is listening, please make an Ada Wong game. I need to know more about this mysterious woman, and not necessarily about like her background or her agenda, but like I just want to play as Ada.
I agree.
And see how she would react to certain situations, because we never see her really escape. We know she survives because she's always there at the end, like haha. But we never see how she survives.
And have you played the separate ways on Resident Evil 4?
No, I haven't.
Okay. Well, I'm going to put that one on the top of your list.
Okay.
Because it's like a separate 6 to 10 hour campaign that explains what Ada is doing over the course of Resident Evil 4. Okay. And you play as her with her unique arsenal, and you get more of an insight into her backstory. So for you, that is a pitch perfect little bit of content that you may not have experienced yet. And I recommend it fully.
Yeah. Now I have something to play, and my educated wish has actually come true. It's come true.
I'm very educated. And, I think from people who are diehard fans of characters in the series, I feel like the Mercenaries mode, which has been kind of a staple since Resident Evil 3, is amazing. It's just kind of like a timed score attack arcade style mode where you play as buffed up versions of your favorite characters, just sort of rampaging through hordes of zombies to combo the highest score possible and keep your run going. And it helps you to really engage with the deeper, more refined combat mechanics of the game, and also just to spend more time with the people and places that resonate so deeply with you. So Mercenaries mode for fans of the game or fans of characters who want more time with them, like Ada. She's very well represented in Mercenaries.
Nice. Well, good. We always learn something new on this podcast, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, I mean, what would you like to see, though? Like, if you had to make an educated wish.
Educated wish. I would like to see Leon and Ada as protagonists fighting against the morally corrupt Umbrella agent Chris Redfield.
Oh, great.
And eventually not fight him to the death, but eventually bring him back to the side of good.
And they would probably do that via Claire Redfield.
Hey, I think maybe being able to use an ensemble cast, and this is all into the, so I don't have a set in my head that Chris is evil. I think he's probably a good guy, and they just want us to think Umbrella is bad.
Yeah.
But Umbrella's probably actually good now.
Yeah.
But I would like Umbrella to be bad. I'd like Chris Redfield to be temporarily morally corrupt, and have to get the whole ensemble cast of characters together to bring him over to the side of light.
To save the world.
To save the world.
No, I think that would be really viable, though, especially with how Chris portrays himself in Resident Evil 8. Like, you never know what he's going to do.
And if he does end up being good, it's just sort of lazy and misinformative storytelling on Capcom's part at that point. If he's a good guy just acting super evil for no reason, then that would be...
It would definitely be like a misunderstood, I think, part of him.
No, and like he can't tell it like Ethan the true nature of what's happening, because he will compromise the mission, so he's got to keep him in the dark.
He's too emotional.
No, he's exactly. He's not a beefcake.
Yeah, he's not a beefcake who punches boulders.
No, he's not. Exactly.
He just splashes water on his dismembered hand and then
that's beefcake.
Reattaches it.
I love how we just accept that as fact in the game and don't really question the nature of it.
It was so funny that they brought that back from Resident Evil 7, where he's getting injured, Ethan's getting injured, and then in Resident Evil 8, his whole hand freaking comes off.
The extent of his injuries are so great, and we just... I think it was really,
we just shake it off, and then we realize, spoilers.
It's because...
It's because spoilers, and I'm not going to say, but if you know. Yeah. All right. Well, then I guess that kind of like brings us to our last really topic. What do you think Resident Evil should be inspired by next, or what comes to mind when you talk about Resident Evil?
Horror-wise?
Yeah.
And to touch on our last topic one more time, I know it'd be for the worst thing in the series ever, but my mind keeps going to time travel. And for the next one, and I know that would be a really bad idea. They should not do it.
Just like space, they shouldn't. They do not send them to space.
They should not do it.
We have Dead Space already.
We have Dead Space.
We have the Callisto Protocol if you need it.
If you dare. We do. We got those things, but like sci-fi meets Resident Evil feels like it could like.
I mean, Resident Evil's already sci-fi.
It's already sci-fi. They are, Resident Evil 3 got pretty sci-fi for me with some of the weaponry and stuff.
Sci-fi horror.
But I feel like time travel. Like, I feel like if Leon had the opportunity to go back and prevent what happened in Raccoon City, that would be like his greatest desire.
Yeah, but then it would create such a paradox.
It would create like an amazing paradox.
Yeah.
That maybe would end with like, no, I'm gonna say. But other horror. That would inspire Resident Evil. Have you ever seen The Descent?
That's the one where these girls go into a cave.
Go spelunking, and like, it's a f***ing scary
I'm
movie.
slightly claustrophobic when it comes to like watching things like that. I can't. I've seen a bit of it, and I hate it. And the only reason why I hate it is because for me, when I'm watching horror movies, I just can't deal with tight spaces. I'm fine in real life with tight spaces, but like when it's games and it's movies, I just can't watch it.
And I'd say my greatest fear is probably like being buried alive or trapped in a cave just until I starve to death.
Oh.
Mash that like button, by the way. Just kidding. And The Descent really played on that, and I don't know how I would want Resident Evil to play on that.
Yeah. We haven't really done a contained, like a really true contained game like since Resident Evil 1.
Like where you're like where claustrophobia is a big factor, and I think Resident Evil 7 kind of brings us back to it.
Oh, that's true. But then they explore.
But then it gets more open and arguably a little bit more diluted. Like if they kept that level of tightness and just really aggressive light, like being lit by flares or total darkness,
right,
and being hunted by like just a different level of creature, I think would be interesting. Another horror movie I saw recently that I feel like maybe that I know how they could take inspiration from it, but really spoke to me was Misery.
Oh my god. Yeah, that
and-
would be
And
scary.
I feel like using that as an opening premise, where like something inspired by that as opening premise, where you're like a kidnapping victim in a remote location, escaping and exposed to the virus or threat somehow through that would be interesting.
That would be cool as a Claire Redfield story, I think.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
because she's kind of got the slightly younger vibe.
Well, and she's a journalist,
Okay.
right?
In the earlier game, she's a college student,
Yeah.
and I don't know what she's in college for.
I might be mixing it up with the animated movie. I think she's a journalist or a White House rep or something
Okay.
in the animated movie. But I feel like it would be apt for her to be stuck in some place and then have to escape.
I think that would be a really cool way to go about it. Maybe even something inspired very vaguely by Squid Game, where
Or Saw.
where like our lovable cast, and very vaguely, I don't have to rip it off, but like where our cast of characters is being held by a mastermind. And
It could be Wesker.
It could be Wesker, and I think the series has like a large enough rogues gallery, so to speak, that there's enough people who have it out for the for our main cast and crew.
Right.
And I think that would be an interesting way to take it.
Yeah. Well, I guess at this point in time, it'll be, we'll just have to wait and see.
We'll have to wait and see, and I'm excited.
Yeah. Well, thanks for tuning in from the real world, dear gamers.
We'll be back next time as we are trapped within a 90s style digirealm with no help of escape.
Leave us a message in the comment box below, wherever this is broadcasting, and let us know your favorite Resident Evil.
Stars.